Chapter 5. Politics and the Divine. The events of 312 and 313 CE laid the groundwork for Constantine's consolidation of power and his calculated strategy in securing the support of the Christian Church within his imperial framework. The system of the Tetrarchy now disintegrated into 4 ruling Augusti across the empire. After the death of Galerius, Licinius, although officially Augustus of the West, controlled the European provinces of Galerius's former dominion, including Thrace and the Balkans, while Maximinus Dia, who had been acclaimed Augustus by his troops, ruled Asia Minor and the eastern provinces. Constantine, legally recognized as Caesar in the West, ruling over Britain, Gaul and Spain, elevated himself to the rank of Augustus without official sanction. Meanwhile, Maxentius, ruling in Rome, took control of Italy and Africa with the support of the Senate and the Praetorian Guard, assuming the title of Augustus in the ancient capital. Constantine and Maxentius, both believing they were the legitimate rulers of the West, claimed their dynastic privileges from their fathers. As tensions fueled between them, Constantine would later present his campaign against Maxentius as a war of liberation against tyranny, portraying himself as the sole legitimate ruler of the Western Empire. He spread this propaganda throughout his loyal network in Gaul, Britain, and northern Italy, painting Maxentius as a cruel and oppressive usurper, driven by a desire to consolidate all the power in the West for himself. In the spring of 321 CE, Constantine, along with 40,000 men, began his march to Rome, securing key towns and reinforcing his authority as he passed through the territories of northern Italy. The Battle of the Milvian Bridge has, to the present day, sparked differing theological and political arguments concerning the motives and significance of the confrontation. Upon Constantine's approach, Maxentius consulted the Sibylline books, the sacred texts kept within the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill. These prophetic texts were turned to at a time of crisis, usually by the Senate or designated priests, and sources state that Maxentius, seeking guidance before the battle, interpreted the omen as favorable, despite warnings of defeat. When the forces met, Constantine had positioned his army at a narrow crossing of the Tiber by the Milvian Bridge, which controlled access to Rome. Maxentius positioned most of his forces behind the Tiber, fortifying the approach to Rome. But the outcome of the battle was decisive. Constantine's forces were strategically arranged, herding their enemy into an aggressive assault, forcing Maxentius and his men into a panic, driving them back toward the bridge. As the weight of the forces mounted in disarray, the foundations of the bridge gave way, and Maxentius and his men were swept into the current of the Tiber, drowning beneath the weight of their armor. Constantine's victory was celebrated in a traditional sense, at least in the beginning, that the gods, not a single god, had granted him their favor. At this time, he continued to mint coins depicting the solar deity Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. It was only years later, after Maxentius's defeat, that Christian sources began to attribute the victory to the Christian god. Lactantius and Eusebius provide the earliest surviving accounts, each describing a different version of the events. The first account records that Constantine had a dream the night before the battle in which he was instructed to mark the soldiers' shields with a heavenly sign. The second account embellishes the story with a vision of a cross that appeared in the sky, accompanied with the words, "In this sign, conquer." Constantine's religious ambiguity has fueled debates on whether his actions stemmed from political pragmatism or genuine religious conviction. Yet it raises a larger question. When exactly was the turning point in which the Roman Empire became a Christian state? The policies that followed his victory at the Milvian Bridge gradually shifted the religious landscape from its traditional pluralism to the integration of Christian institutions and privileges. Constantine dismantled Maxentius's elite units, including the Praetorian Guard, to eliminate the threat of potential rivals, as such forces had long been a source of political instability, and replaced them with his own imperial guard, the Scholae Palatinae. To ensure a smooth transition of power, he retained the Senate's prestige and symbolic authority, ensuring they maintained influence in governance to preserve stability within Rome. The anti-Christian laws from Diocletian's order of persecution of 303 CE were rendered unenforceable, effectively ending the persecution of Christians in Constantine's territories. Church property was gradually restored to Christian communities, and bishops and clergy who had been driven away under Maxentius's orders returned to the city. Christian cemeteries were legally recognized, allowing the church to continue their communal activities once again. Constantine also restored the privileges that had previously been stripped from church officials. Among these changes, the laws restricting the prohibition of private divination were further revised. It had been long established in Roman law that no one was to intervene with divine interpretations of the emperor's fate, a prohibition reaffirmed by Diocletian and Maximian. Constantine expanded on this restriction, forbidding not only divinations concerning the emperor's fate, but extending it to all forms of private divination concerning any individual. Only state-controlled divination remained legal. A part of this measure served to prevent the predominantly polytheist Roman population from challenging Constantine's legitimacy, thereby limiting the risk of plots or conspiracy. The banning of private divination redirected sacred authority into imperial control, undermining the independence and influence of traditional polytheist priesthoods. As privileges continued to be granted to church clergy under Constantine, Christians under Maximinus's rule in the East lacked the endorsement of imperial favor. Polytheism remained the dominant religion of the Roman Empire, and Constantine would balance his authority over a narrow line between Christianity and polytheism, delicately maneuvering his policies to shift the balance of power. The Edict of Milan, 313 CE. With the empire now divided between three rulers, Constantine and Licinius turned their attention to their new rival. In the east, the Edict of Tolerance established by Galerius had been largely ignored by Maximinus. As a result, his enmity toward the Christians renewed the persecutions. This hostility extended to his younger co-ruler, Licinius, who, in comparison, had shown leniency toward the Christians, undermining his authority and branding him, in Maximinus's eyes, as subversive toward polytheistic traditions. The following year, after Maxentius's defeat in February 313 CE, an imperial council was held between Constantine and Licinius in Milan. During this meeting, Constantine's half-sister was married to Licinius to secure a dynastic alliance between them. During the council, a policy of religious freedom across the empire was established between them. The decree read, Constantine Augustus in the west and Licinius Augustus in the east thought that it was proper to grant both to Christians and to all men freedom to follow the religion which each wished, and that the churches which had been seized from Christians should be restored. And they thought it proper that all men should have full authority to observe that religion which each preferred, so that whatever divinity dwells in heaven may be favorable and propitious to us and to all who live under our government. This act united the eastern and western provinces of the empire, but it had political implications as it further marginalized Maximinus from the unity of imperial administration, isolating him and undermining his legitimacy in the east. The wording of the edict reinforced the alliance between Licinius and Constantine and ensured the Christians were protected under their imperial favor, establishing peace between the state and the Christians. The decree was carefully conceived as not to alienate the dominant polytheistic communities that constituted the core of the empire, where Constantine retained the title Pontifex Maximus, preserving his role as chief priest of the traditional polytheist rites. Yet polytheists were gradually marginalized through symbolic, financial, and institutional shifts as Constantine's favor toward Christianity became evident. Although polytheism remained legal and active, Christianity became the institution which appealed most to Constantine's imperial strategy. Over time, support toward polytheism would become symbolic rather than institutional, visible in the form of inscriptions, coins, and temples, which remained active even under reduced funding. The Christians would receive preferential legal treatment and official positions, consequently sidelining polytheists from imperial administration. These measures ensured that Christianity could find some compatibility within the Roman imperial framework that had long excluded them, and would significantly benefit Constantine in consolidating his authority over the Western Empire. Even if his actions had genuine religious intent at this time, He carefully maneuvered his political policies to reinforce his legitimacy across the empire's religiously diverse masses, adjusting his image for divine endorsement by every god, granting him universal power. Constantine sought to harness the growing Christian faith, incorporating it into his reign in ways previous emperors had not. He was aware of Christianity's organizational reach, and his initial engagement proved to be strategic rather than theological, a tool to ensure loyalty and stabilize administration across a vast empire, and a method to strengthen his political base against potential rivals by expanding his network of support. Renowned for his military reputation and political momentum, Constantine had little reason to fear political rivals. His major victory was quickly known around the empire, and his growing support of both polytheists and Christians affirmed his authority within the imperial hierarchy. In contrast, Maximinus's influence was deteriorating. His authority was confined to the provinces of the east, and his supporters were not as diverse due to his deliberate exclusion of Christians, even from military services. The polytheist soldiers who remained in his army may have been loyal to the gods, but their loyalty did not extend to him and his increasingly oppressive religious policies. Even after the Edict of Milan was issued, policies of religious freedom would have been expected to bring relief across the East. However, there would be no refuge from persecution under the reign of Maximinus. Those refusing to sacrifice to the Roman gods were tortured, burned, and thrown to wild beasts to be executed. Church leaders were exiled, and wealth was extracted from the confiscation of church property. Eusebius of Caesarea recounts how local officials in Gaza destroyed churches and sought to eradicate the Christian community there, more so than in any other city under Maximinius's reign. He records an episode in Caesarea in which Maximinus was holding his birthday celebrations during November. The highlight of the festivities was the Christian martyr Agapios, who was exposed to wild beasts and, having been severely mauled by a bear, was returned to prison after the spectacle and executed the following day by being cast alive into the sea. Framing Christianity as less a matter of faith and more a threat to imperial stability, he justified his harsh measures to suppress the subversive movement and enforce loyalty to the state. It was inevitable that Maximinus's religious stances would soon interfere with the governance of Licinius and Constantine as they strengthened their political alliance. Even if Constantine began to adopt a new faith at this point, his early policies focused on the practicality of consolidating Christianity into a polytheist empire, aligning his political ambitions. He maintained engagement with polytheistic traditions, retaining images of Sol Invictus on coins that circulated throughout the empire, which would gradually incorporate Christian imagery later in his reign. Recognizing its organizational potential, Constantine harnessed Christianity for administrative cohesion. But what might have been the consequences had he excluded polytheism after his victory? Firstly, he would have faced a loss of legitimacy in a predominantly polytheist society, especially in Rome, opposed by the traditionalist citizens, primarily the Senate and the elite. To declare a clean break from the traditional gods of Rome and its ancestral traditions was a dangerous move, with the potential to provoke rebellion across the empire. Another consequence was the risk of military isolation from the largely polytheist soldiers, as loyalty within the ranks would have been severed. Jupiter's influence still reigned over Rome. Any disregard for the god would have branded Constantine as a tyrant, as his authority would no longer be considered divinely sanctioned. To abandon polytheistic traditions so abruptly would have brought a collapse to civic order to which religion was deeply bound, slowing his efforts to consolidate power in the West. Constantine walked a delicate line over the division of polytheist and Christian loyalty after his victory and throughout the early years of his reign. Shortly after the Edict of Milan was issued by Constantine and Licinius, Maximinus advanced his army westward, moving further into Thrace to assert his authority as Augustus of the East. But morale within his ranks was low, compounded by fear of facing the broad and disciplined forces of Licinius and Constantine. His anti-Christian policies had alienated local populations, many of whom were excluded from military recruitment, further weakening his position. Upon learning of Maximinus's advance, Licinius gathered his men to confront the oncoming threat. On April 30th, 313 CE, the anniversary of Maximinus's reign, the two armies met in battle at Cyrallum, Thrace. Maximinus's army, unable to hold a strategic position against their rival, disintegrated under their low morale and the lack of discipline among the troops, which plunged his forces into a humiliating defeat. Maximinus was forced to flee east into Asia Minor, his army having deserted him, and he soon died, leaving Licinius in full control of the Eastern Roman Empire. Now Licinius promptly ratified the Milan Agreement in Nicomedia, Maximinus's former imperial capital, ending the persecutions and restoring confiscated property back to the church. To prevent dynastic rivals from challenging his authority, Licinius had Maximinus's children and wife killed. His violent purge even extended to his own relatives, eliminating selected family members he deemed a threat to his rule. Divided between two rulers, East and West, the empire now maintained a unified policy of religious tolerance across its expanse. Privileges continued to be issued under new imperial policies concerning the civil rights of Christians, who could no longer be persecuted for practicing their religion. Church clergies were given legal privileges, allowing them the right to own property and hold official offices. Back in Carthage, the rival divisions of the church continued to persist. During 313 CE, Donatus had succeeded Majorinus as bishop, continuing the leadership of the Donatist faction. The Donatists still contested against the validity of Caecilian's appointment, declaring it invalid for allegedly handing over church scriptures to Roman authorities during the persecutions. Feeling marginalized from the church, the Donatists approached Constantine, asking him to intervene with the ongoing conflict against Caecilian and his supporters. This marked the first instance in which the Christian Church appealed to imperial authority to resolve its internal disputes. Seeking to preserve unity and order within the Christian communities, Constantine agreed to intervene. He appointed Pope Miltiades in Rome, together with several Gallic bishops, to judge the matters between Caecilian and the Donatists. However, to the Donatists' frustration, the council ruled in favor of Caecilian. Refusing to accept the Roman decision, they appealed. Constantine convened the Council of Arles in August 314 CE, the first empire-wide Christian synod. Once again, the judgment favored Caecilian. The council reaffirmed that ecclesiastical authority rested with the collective body of bishops rather than with independent separatist groups such as the Donatists. Yet the Donatists persisted against the ruling, prompting Constantine, losing his patience with their defiance, to write them the following letter. "What more do you want? When you see that the case has been examined and decided by so many bishops in accordance with the judgment of the Holy Catholic Church, you persist in appealing as though you alone were right and refuse to accept the decision of so many whose judgment, by the inspiration of God, cannot be in error. Therefore, I consider you not only mistaken, but even insane in your stubbornness." The letter demonstrates just how closely imperial and ecclesiastical authority were becoming tied. In the following year of 315 CE, Constantine's pluralistic tolerance began to wane as he gradually imposed restrictions on certain unauthorized polytheistic practices. Laws against private divination were expanded, and new administrative controls limited the addition or removal of items from temples or shrines for sacred rites, unless authorized by the emperor or approved by the public court, effectively limiting private worship. Polytheistic rituals gradually became excluded from state sponsorship, as temples were stripped of imperial funding and the right to collect certain taxes and revenues, severely limiting their operation. Those accused of participating in secretive or malicious ritual acts would be punished by death. In this way, Constantine ensured control over polytheistic religious practices. This indirectly elevated Christian legal protection, as they did not engage in such rituals, granting Christian places of worship greater protection and fewer restrictions than polytheistic temples. Although polytheism was not banned, many of its rituals were criminalized under laws prohibiting private magic and divination. It was during the same year that Christian symbols gradually appeared on military standards, while coins issued by Constantine bearing these symbols began circulating throughout the empire. Promotions and command positions were gradually granted to Christian leaders. However, although tolerance extended into Licinius's eastern territories, no Christian symbols were publicly endorsed, nor were Christian officials promoted as they were under Constantine. Although sacrificial practices integral to military culture, such as divination before battle, were legally constrained under Constantine, they remained largely unaffected under Licinius. During the next year, in 316 CE, the Donatists persisted their appeals, forcing Constantine, who was growing increasingly frustrated with the matter, to intervene personally. He issued a rescript and dispatched officials to enforce the council's decrees, asserting that imperial authority backed the ecclesiastical rulings, and warning the Donatists that those who did not comply would be accountable under imperial law. The issued decrees mark the first measure to exercise coercive enforcement to ensure compliance with the Church's decisions, establishing a precedent for future imperial interventions in ecclesiastical disputes. Constantine was eager to strengthen Christian unity, not because he was theologically inclined, but because he needed the organization of Christianity to serve a stabilizing force in his consolidation of the Roman Empire. A rigorist sect, such as the Donatists, threatened both public order and church unity, presenting a challenge that would ultimately hinder Constantine from harnessing the church as a unifying force. Supporting Caecilian was a crucial path to church stability. That year, Constantine faced yet another problem in imperial affairs, as he believed Licinius had failed to adequately secure the Balkans, a key route for invasions from the north against barbarian incursions. In response, Constantine reinforced military presence in the region to secure key provinces from threats, particularly Illyricum, a strategically important region for controlling the Adriatic, the Danube frontier, and communication between the east and west. Licinius perceived the presence of Constantine's troops in his territory as a direct challenge to his authority, causing tension between the two rulers. Sources note that confrontations broke out between the two armies over control of key frontier provinces. Eventually, a treaty brought about a temporary settlement which divided the empire administratively, with Constantine securing the strategically crucial Western Balkans and Licinius controlling the east. But the temporary peace did not resolve disputes, and Licinius remained suspicious of Constantine, overreaching his authority into eastern regions under his control. During the year 317 CE, Licinius continued to express more favor toward polytheistic communities as temples and rituals continued to remain unrestricted in his territories. He avoided promoting Christians and instead limited their privileges compared to those under Constantine's control. For example, whilst Constantine exempted clergy from compulsory public services, Licinius did not, signaling a divergence from Constantine's policy of Christian privilege. Between the years of 320 and 321 CE, Constantine began to perceive Licinius's tolerance of polytheists as hostility toward Christian communities as he continued to treat them less favorably. Trust eventually began to erode as Constantine questioned the loyalty of the East. Licinius, now embracing a new stance in his policy that diverged from the Edict of Milan, banned bishops from convening in synods and restored sacrifices in public ceremonies. He forbade the women in his household from associating with Christians and issued an edict prohibiting Christians from certain military commands in the Eastern Army, as he considered Christian soldiers to lack morale and discipline. By 323 CE, Licinius ordered the execution of Christian leaders. Those who were associated with Constantine's influence were specifically targeted, rekindling the persecutions in the East that had long ceased since the death of Maximinus. Churches were leveled to the ground. Eusebius recounts that merciless executions were made as part of public spectacles, with some Christians being dismembered and thrown into the sea where fish consumed their flesh. Although less extensive than previous persecutions, it widened the divide between the two emperors. Licinius's motivations were not purely theological. His policies also served as a strategic barrier against Constantine's threat to push territorial control further into the east. Christians were considered politically unreliable, as they aligned themselves with Constantine, whose public alliance with the Church created an imbalance to loyalty to imperial authority in the East. Licinius's shift in policy increasingly focused on state security, suppressing Constantine's influence in regions under his control. His response was to act against Constantine's use of the church as a political base of support. Soon the two rulers began maneuvering their armies in preparation for inevitable conflict. Anti-Christian policies began to harden, especially where Constantine's influence reached the Balkan frontier. As Constantine prepared his campaign against the Goths and Sarmatians along the Danube, he maneuvered his troops into territories under Licinius's control. Licinius perceived this as an invasion into his boundaries and mobilized his armies along the Danube and in Thrace in response. In 324 CE, skirmishes finally mounted to full-scale conflicts. Christian sources suggest Constantine cast the confrontation as being endorsed by a Christian god, presenting himself as a defender of the Christians and emphasizing Licinius, a believer of a multitude of gods, as an enemy of the Christians. Finally, in April of 324 CE, Constantine crossed into Eastern Balkan territory, delivering the final provocation that ignited civil war between the two emperors. The initial clash between forces occurred in Adrianople, resulting in Licinius retreating from Thrace eastward across the Hellespont, where he regrouped his army. Outmaneuvered by Constantine's tactics, which cut him off from access to Europe, Licinius, whose army was becoming weaker with each defeat, became isolated in Asia Minor. It was at the Battle of Chrysopolis in September 324 CE that Constantine decisively defeated Licinius, who fled to Nicomedia, his imperial home base. Constantine initially spared Licinius's life, persuaded by the pleas of his sister, who had extracted a promise from him not to kill her husband. Licinius was said to have offered to abdicate from his imperial seat on the condition to live as a private citizen. But the promise to spare his life proved meaningless, and eventually Licinius was taken into custody and sent to Thessalonica in Macedonia, where he was kept under guard for a year until Constantine had him executed by strangulation or hanging on the charge of plotting a revolt, though the accusation was likely fabricated by Constantine to finally eliminate his rival. With no emperor to challenge his authority in the East, Constantine, as sole ruler of Rome, continued his focus on political and religious unity. The tetrarchic system was now dismantled, leaving the empire once again vulnerable to dynastic succession. The Council of Nicaea, 325 CE. Constantine turned his focus to another theological dispute within the Church in 325 CE. He convened the Council of Nicaea to resolve the Arian controversy, another conflict which threatened both imperial and ecclesiastical unity, as the two were now closely tied. A debate arose around the nature of Christ in relation to God, the Father. Arius, a Christian presbyter from Alexandria, argued that Jesus was not co-eternal with the Father, but a created being, subordinate to God. Such religious divisions threatened political stability, as bishops and cities could be split among different factions. Constantine, while not an expert in theology, wished to resolve the dispute, and therefore called for the assembly, even offering prayers himself, seeking divine guidance to achieve a resolution among the bishops. The outcome of the council resulted in the condemnation of Arius, who, along with his teachings, was declared heretical. The Nicene Creed was established and formally read. We believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of all things visible and invisible, and in one Lord Jesus Christ, the Son of God, begotten of the Father, the only begotten, that is, from the substance of the Father, God from God, light from light, true God from true God, begotten not made, of one substance, homoousios, with the Father, through whom all things came into being, things in heaven and things on earth, who for us men and for our salvation came down and was made flesh, became man, suffered, and rose on the third day, ascended into the heavens, and is coming to judge the living and the dead, and in the Holy Spirit. But as for those who say, there was when he was not, and before being born he was not, and that he came into existence out of nothing, or who assert that the Son of God is of a different hypostasis or substance, or is created, mutable, or subject to change, the Catholic and Apostolic Church anathematizes them. With the council in agreement that Jesus was fully divine and eternal, Constantine issued edicts requiring all bishops across the empire to adhere to the creed. Arius was then exiled to Illyricum. It was ordered that his writings be burned, as to leave no evidence of its existence, and those in possession of his work to be put to death. The Nicene Council and its outcome signified the first time imperial authority intervened with church doctrine to maintain unity in the Christian community, establishing a precedent that the emperor could convene councils to enforce orthodoxy, and affirmed the authority of the imperial office in determining church doctrine, marking the beginning of Christianity as a state-supported religion within the Roman Empire. In the following year, Constantine turned his attention away from holy matters to address another problem at hand. The young son of Licinius, his nephew, who was now 11 years of age. Feeling it was due time to extinguish the potential rival from making future claims that would challenge his authority, Constantine had the young boy captured and executed. In the same year, he also executed his wife, Fausta, the daughter of former Emperor Maximian, and his eldest son, Crispus, either for political or personal reasons, securing power entirely under himself and his remaining sons, Constantius II, Constantine II, and Constans. During the years 327 to 328 CE, Constantine's focus remained on consolidating loyalty in the East. Former officials and military units were reassigned commanders who were loyal to his administration. The East and West were now firmly under Constantine's hand as he secured church hierarchy, expanding the privileges of clergy by exempting them from the burdens of public service and tax. Churches were rebuilt and newly constructed, while bishops were empowered throughout all provinces of the East. Regular synods convened, creating a network of empire-wide ecclesiastical coordination. Constantine still tolerated polytheistic cults during this time, but he increasingly marginalized them from imperial favor. Each of his sons were given the title of Caesar and entrusted with responsibilities in the empire, establishing a new dynastic order. Constantine now sought a new capital, one that would embody his imperial vision, reflecting the grandeur of Rome yet breaking away from its ancient traditions to forge an epicenter sanctioned by a new god. Initiating infrastructure in Thrace and Bithynia, linking the east and west of the Roman Empire, Constantine began laying the foundations of his new imperial metropolis. On May 11, 330 CE, Constantine dedicated Byzantium as his new capital, renaming it Nova Roma, New Rome, though it quickly became known as Constantinople. Strategically, the capital stood at a greater defensive position, and like Rome, projected the image of a pluralistic city. Rome's political and military significance had waned. Culturally and traditionally, it would remain the ideological remnant of ancestral tradition. After the establishment of new imperial capitals of the Tetrarchy, the redistribution of political influence had already sidelined Rome for many years, opening the path for Constantinople to rise as a new center of imperial authority aligned with the networks of Christian power. Constantinople detached the influence of the polytheist elites who had long dominated Roman governance. Traditional deities continued to be honored across the capital, Constantine even having his image carved upon a column in the city forum, portraying himself as Apollo Helios with a radiate crown, holding a spear and orb, said to contain a fragment of the true cross. Constantine still played an act of religious ambiguity, balancing the sensitivity of polytheist elites in a new capital that leaned toward Christian favor. But his efforts to display reverence toward polytheism were viewed as a shallow move to connect himself to the god's divine power, whilst openly favoring the church in his policy. Constantinople was inherently Christian, with superficial gestures to preserve polytheist imagery, to evoke the grandeur and traditional prestige of Rome, a calculated distraction to the ongoing Christian projects that gradually shaped the city, redefining civic life. Christianity dominated the city, politically and religiously. Its authority overshadowed the gods, rendering their image as secondary to Christian power. Constantine's vision of imperial power was sanctioned by the Christian god with bishops and clergy at his side, serving as his official agents. As the capital increasingly shaped itself around Christian institutions, polytheist cults were still tolerated, yet they received little support. According to Eusebius, Constantine prayed in the churches, demonstrating he actively participated in Christian worship at this time, linking imperial authority with the faith. His personal involvement in church matters, supervising dedications and guiding bishop appointments, notably linked imperial and religious life. By the time Constantine's health started to deteriorate, Constantinople has been firmly established as the new imperial center, with Christianity fully integrated into its governance and prepared to secure the succession of Constantine's dynasty. Baptism. As Constantine's health continued to decline in 337 CE, he assigned his sons governance throughout the empire according to their ages and rank. His eldest, Constantine II, received the western provinces of Gaul, Britain, and Spain. His middle son, Constantius II, took command of the eastern territories comprising Asia Minor, Syria, and Egypt. Constans, the youngest, was entrusted with Italy, Africa, and Illyricum. It was near Nicomedia, the city in which Diocletian first posted the Edict of Persecution, that Constantine met his end. On May 22, 337 CE, he was baptized shortly before his death by Eusebius of Nicomedia. His body was transported to Constantinople, where he was laid to rest in a mausoleum within the Church of the Holy Apostles. He had commissioned the mausoleum himself and requested his final resting place to be positioned at the center of 12 tombs representing the 12 apostles, signifying himself as the 13th apostle. Constantine's baptism remains a topic of controversy. Throughout his reign, he demonstrated an opportunistic political strategy, which secured him sole rulership of the Roman Empire. His religious interventions to support the notion of repentance for those who had lapsed may have been a means to legitimize his own conversion to Christianity, despite his endorsement of polytheistic practices during the integration of the new religion into the empire. Had he converted to Christianity earlier in his reign, he may have struggled to secure the loyalty of the Christian populace, as he still needed to maintain the support of the largely polytheistic population. He would have had to renounce his participation, even if only symbolically, in polytheistic rituals, unable to present himself as a true Christian. His policies promoted the endorsement of Christianity, which systematically marginalized polytheists during his later years of his reign. If his inclination toward Christianity was not genuine, but as a strategy to harness the organizational power of the Church to consolidate unity in the empire, he may not have been welcomed favorably in the divine realm of the gods for his impiety and reckless morality, which undermined the ancestral traditions of Rome and its long-revered pantheon. He had understood that a Christian God would abolish the sin he had accumulated along his journey, serving as a path to abolish the guilt he had committed. Zosimus, writing 2 centuries after the death of Constantine, argued that Constantine's abandonment of the traditional gods, combined with Rome's weakening military, had begun the empire's decline. His policies toward Christianity certainly allowed the religion to embed itself within the empire long after his death, allowing it to flourish under future rulers. The Church's cohesion and structured organization offered the potential to unify the empire in ways that fragmented local cults and rituals, which lacked empire-wide coordination, could not, particularly during a time of political instability. Christian institutions adapted more effectively to the empire's evolving political, social, and administrative challenges. It was not about religious tolerance, but imperial efficiency. A single god and a single church could mirror the structure of Rome's bureaucratic hierarchy. The Church offered something emperors craved: unity without negotiation. It eliminated religious rivals, replaced plurality with orthodoxy, and commanded submission under the mask of tolerance. National religious assimilation is the process in which a state integrates belief into its political policies to bind a diverse population, unifying a shared identity and creating loyalty to a ruling power. Where polytheism practiced this integration through inclusive civic rituals and the addition of foreign gods into its pantheon, Christianity redefined this concept by demanding exclusive allegiance to one God and one church as a singular foundation of imperial loyalty. Whether or not Constantine was personally religious, the Christian Church became politically invaluable to him. Supporting a unified Orthodox Church that rejected rigorous sects, such as the Novatianists and the Donatists, and ensured that doctrinal divisions would not threaten religious or civic order, effectively linking political stability with religious conformity. The Church offered protection from usurpations that plagued the Roman imperial system and retained cohesion across regime changes because its loyalty was theological and hierarchical rather than requiring personal or dynastic allegiance. Since the Church demanded loyalty to Christ over an emperor, it gave the Church durable stability which was not dependent on individual authorities. Even when emperors changed or were assassinated, the bishopric system remained intact, with bishops maintaining their offices and leading stable communities. Geographically, the Church was more organized, its ecclesiastical network crossing over divided imperial territories. For example, a bishop in Carthage or Alexandria could communicate with bishops in Rome or Gaul, despite the empire's political fragmentation. In comparison, traditional Roman religion held no central priesthood, possessed no unifying doctrine, and temples were independent and community-based. Each city had its own calendar, rites, and patron gods. As a result, religious unity was not empire-wide. The imperial cult was designed to direct loyalty toward the emperor, but the system was deeply flawed, especially during the 3rd century crisis. Constantine would harness the unity and stability of the church hierarchy to present himself as an emperor sanctioned by a Christian god, a patron of a unified faith, a new archetype of sacred ruler, directing allegiance to him as a representative of Christ, rather than a divine being himself, once worshipped through the imperial cult. The Church's ecclesiastical development established regional councils, allowing Constantine a structured institution that could support his imperial authority, religious legitimacy, and administrative control. During a time of crisis, the Church maintained itself against persecution and political upheaval, demonstrating the solidity of its centralized and hierarchical structure. It could be commanded, organized, and disciplined as an extension of imperial administration in ways that polytheistic cults could not. By necessity, the Christian Church had developed a structure that proved uniquely compatible with imperial governance. By the year 300 CE, the Church had developed a clearly defined hierarchy of bishops, presbyters, and deacons. It had regular councils to resolve disputes, enforce doctrine, and impose discipline, offering clear lines of authority and communication through its networks. These councils created synods that responded to crises of internal disorder, establishing a system of reconciliation. It proved to be a solid political strategy to align with the most cohesive and organized religious network, one capable of withstanding a crumbling empire. Bishops became politically valuable allies, not simply as clerical figures, but as regional authorities capable of enforcing ideological and administrative unity across the empire. Constantine quickly recognized their potential in managing religious dissent and local instability, especially in a post-crisis empire desperate for cohesion, making the Church an invaluable tool to an emperor intent on consolidating sole rule over the Roman Empire.